This is the Constitution song from Mount Currie, composed during a prior constitutional crisis on this land. And it's a lot more powerful when you all choose to sing along. Last week in Brooklyn, they were a little too chicken shit to do that. Um, but I assume in Corte Madera, in the Bay Area, they're not too scared. The tune's super easy. So once you catch it, you got to sing, okay? That's the rule. Here goes. Hey, oh, hey, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, hey, oh, yeah, hey, 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 oh, yeah, hey, oh, hey, oh. Canada is all Indian land. Canada is all Indian land. Oh, Canada is all Indian land. Yeah, hey, ah, ho, hey, ah, ho, hey, ah, ho, hey, hey, oh, hey, ah, ho, hey, hey, oh, yeah, hey, ah, hey, ah, hey, ah, oh, yeah, hey, ah, oh, hey, ah, oh. America is all Indian land. America is all Indian land. America is all Indian land. Yeah, hey, ah, ho, hey, ah, ho. Not bad. Um, they say you should never judge a book by its cover, but today I'm going to make the case that you could and maybe even should judge my first book, We Survived the Night, by this cover. Let me explain. This artwork is called Coyote Sees the World Clearly by Jean Quick to See Smith. Now, Jean Quick to See Smith was one of the most significant American painters of the last century. Most would qualify that and say that Jean was one of the most significant Native American painters of the last century, but I'm going to take it a step further because I can't help myself and say that Jean was one of the most significant artists of the last century. And I'm going to say that in part because Jean was one of the most significant painters to ever represent this guy right here, the trickster coyote, who is one of the most significant figures in North American culture and, dare I say, history and current affairs. Indigenous peoples all the way from Central America to Western Canada used to tell stories about the trickster coyote, including Jean's people and my people. You see, about 5,000 years ago, according to linguists, archaeologists, and our own oral history, Jean's people, the Salish from what is now Montana, and my people, the Secwepemc Nation from what is now British Columbia, Canada, used to be one people. In fact, before colonization, sometimes we referred to ourselves as coyote people, by which we meant we understood ourselves and our world through stories about our trickster ancestor, Coyote, who was sent to the earth by Creator to set things in order, and while he did some good, he was often up to no good. After filling the rivers with salmon and populating the lands with descendants, he turned around and used those fish to try to marry into every single one of the native villages along the river because he was a bit of a womanizer. And after having all those kids, he abandoned us because Coyote was probably the most epic deadbeat dad ever known to human history. In every single story about this guy, he was an example to our children of how not to be. And yet, in our account of creation, Coyote was second only to the Creator himself. A representation of the contradictions inherent to our own human nature. An embodiment of the paradoxes that drive and ride the metamorphoses of the world. And so when I was thinking about whose artwork I wanted to use on the cover of my first book, the first person to come to mind was Jean Quick to See Smith. And so I reached into my phone and looked at my contact list of aunties, and I got in touch with someone who's an auntie in the Indian way, who has one of the most impressive moccasin telegraphs ever stitched across Indian country. Her name's Janine Antoine. She appears in this book. In fact, Janine is married to a guy named Dick Trudell, who Ted Kennedy used to call the king of the Indians. That's a direct quote. Janine used to run a gallery, actually, for native art right here in San Francisco, where my own father used to show his work. And so she can reach just about any artist across Indian country. If you check out her personal collection, it proves it. And, you know, in Indian country, we often say that we're all related, by which we mean we can all find common connection. In fact, there's a sister of a rather significant Native American political figure who's sitting right in this audience right now, who's in the book. But being related also often means that we have history. And so when I reached out to Janine about getting in touch with Jean Quick to See Smith, she told me, I'll give you her email, but you cannot, under any circumstance, use my name. So I reached out to Jean Quick to See Smith, sans Janine's name, and the very next day, Jean got back to me and said, of course you can use Coyote Sees the World Clearly on the cover of your book. Just send 2 copies to my Family Foundation library. So I told Knopf, my publisher, to double it and send 4 because 4 is a sacred number for our people. And I went on my way. Now, here's where this story takes a turn that requires a little bit of additional setup, because the truth of the matter is that in this book, I am breaking a lot of the rules prescribed to nonfiction. In this book and in my work, I leave space for tricksters, for spirits, for ancestors, the beyond, as ideas, as metaphors, but also perhaps potentially real agents in the here and now. And I say that because 3 weeks after Jean gave me her permission to use her work on the cover of this book, she died. To the best of my knowledge, this cover was the last thing she gave her personal permission to use her artwork. Earlier this year, I found myself in New York City on the first Thursday of a month, so I wandered down to the Gallery District to catch a show by an up-and-coming native painter named Jordan Ann Craig. And as I was walking out of that show, I turned left, and I looked to my left, and who was on with a retrospective at the Garth Greenan Gallery but none other than Jean Quick to See Smith. So of course I walked in. And what was I greeted by when I stepped foot in the gallery? Not 1, but 2 artworks representing the trickster coyote. A big painting on the back wall, the largest one in the show, and a big sculpture, the only one in the show, right in the center of the gallery. Because if I know one thing about that trickster coyote, he is not going to settle for 1 piece of artwork in his honor. No, he needs at least 2. And so I thought to myself, I have to tell someone that this is the truth of this scene. So I cased the room, and I identified the guy who looked like he probably owned the place. I've been in a lot of galleries in my day. And I walked up to him and I said, hey, you don't know me, I don't know you, but this is who I am and how I'm related to Jean Quick to See Smith and her artwork. And of course, he was the gallery owner. I had profiled him correctly. And after I finished my story, he said, wow, man, you're crazy. Before Jean died, she told me that she was going to visit me from the beyond. So here is what I am saying with this book and with my work. In fact, here's what I am insisting. That my people's approach to stories, to nonfiction, in our lives and on this land, which was ours for thousands and thousands and thousands of years before it was the United States, before it was Canada, still gets at the truth of how stories unfold on this land, which was ours a whole heck of a lot longer than it was anyone else's. You all said so yourselves. Tsq'secen, thank you all so much for coming out. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation with an author and a friend who I greatly admire, Rebecca Solnit. This has been a special oral chapter, so to speak, from We Survived the Night, a coyote story performed orally the way that that was done for thousands of years before we've had this blip in our culture of literacy, which is going away now. And I call it Cover Story. Tsq'secen, thank you.
Well, that's a hard act to follow, so I'm going to be brief. I wanted to welcome everybody to Book Passage, though, and my name is Allison Bainbridge. I want to acknowledge that we are on land once stewarded by the Sierra Mono, Southern Sierra, Miwok, Chukchansi, Yokut, and Awanichi tribes. I'm sorry if I destroyed the pronunciations there, but I wanted to pay them honor. I want to thank our in-person audience for joining us, as well as those of you joining by Zoom. And I especially want to thank our featured authors. It is my absolute honor to host this in celebration of Julian Brave NoiseCat's new book, We Survived the Night. Julian is joined by writer and author of 25 books, historian, activist, and a valued friend of Book Passage, Rebecca Solnit. I anticipate with this powerful duo that we will bear witness to a deep and illuminating conversation centered on Julian's stunning work, in which he blends oral history, as you could see earlier, journalism, and memoir to create a narrative nonfiction that has been heralded as a book that is unique, unusual, and will most likely win many awards. This book tells a story of survival and the indigenous experience, and Julian is a storyteller, a master storyteller, as you can see. Local author Tommy Orange, who he was in conversation with last night, describes the book as written in gorgeous, sparse prose. We Survived the Night reads like a novel. It combines investigative journalism, folklore, and a deeply personal father-son journey in a searing portrait of a community fighting for self-determination in a fractured nation. Julian was born to, and I can't pronounce this, can you say it? Secwepemc, father and a Jewish-Irish mother who primarily raised him. She is here in our audience. I want to honor her because we honor moms. She was extremely supportive when Julian left Oakland to make sense of his indigenous heritage and his identity, his own identity. At the root of the book are themes that we can all relate to, me included, so many of them, although we're from different cultures, especially if we have come from a family with complex issues, most of us have, dealt with intimate family members who have struggled with substance abuse or mental health issues, grapple with a relationship with a parent who's left, and in some cases, such as Julian and his father, were able to reconcile, journey to explore our roots, enjoy the support of a parental figure in discovering our identity. Julian Brave NoiseCat, after reading this book, it is a proud member of the Canim Lake Band. Did you say it? Thank you. Tsq'secen, and descendant of the wrought Nation of Mount Curry. He is a writer, filmmaker, and you should absolutely see his powerful documentary Sugarcane, which is available on Hulu and Disney Plus. Yes. He's a powwow dancer and a student of Salish art and history. Please give a warm welcome to Julian and Rebecca.
I just want to start by saying that we're on the unceded territory of the Coast Miwok here in Marin County, a little south of the southern Pomo, and they're here in the room and they are still stewards of the land, and some amazing things are happening. I was there a year ago when they got back 600 acres near Dillon Beach. They're stewards with the National Park Service at Point Reyes National Seashore. They were the past, they are the present, they will be the future. And I grew up on this land in this county, so it's really great to be here. Spent some time walking around oak trees earlier today, and but I just wanted to clear that up before we get started. So hello everybody, welcome. And oh my gosh, Julian, I first met you 7 years ago, and you told me you were going to write a book, and it was a really different book. And I wonder about all the books you thought you were going to write and how they turned into this one. And if you want to tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I think we met at the People's Climate March in San Francisco, right? It was
God, there were so many, but I know
2018, I think.
Yeah,
somewhere around there. So I spent the last 10 years of my life cobbling together a career with a combination of hustling journalism gigs on the side while working in nonprofits, in environmental politics and the sort of the progressive movement, until I was able to finally get a book contract and to set out to write the book that became We Survived the Night and to direct a documentary, Sugarcane. Originally, this book was going to be organized. I kind of thought about it initially as almost like a foreign correspondence book, but about Indian country, because I think that Indian country is quite foreign to most Americans, unfortunately. And then a couple of things happened. In 2021, over 200 potential unmarked graves were found on the grounds of the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia, Canada. It was actually one of the schools that my family was sent to unlearn our Indian ways. And not long after that, I got a call from a friend and colleague from my journalism days named Emily Cassie, who asked me if I would be open to co-directing a documentary about the subject with her. And I had just signed a book contract, and I never directed a film of any length, not even like a TikTok. And so I told her I had to think about it. And as I did, Emily forged ahead and found a First Nation that was going to begin its own investigation. And so when I got back to her 2 weeks later, she told me that investigation was happening at St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake, British Columbia. And when she said that, I was completely floored, because out of 139 Indian residential schools across Canada, Em had chosen to focus our documentary on the one school that my family was sent to and where my father was actually born and found minutes later in a trash incinerator. So that really sort of transformed the trajectory of the art that I was making. It transformed that documentary, and it also transformed this book, because I made the decision after that, if I was going to look in the face, as so many Native people have in the last 4 years since these discoveries of the graves of children at these schools, I felt that it was really important that I reconcile and try to figure out a relationship with my dad in order to try to tell his story and our story, because I'm a child of two worlds, and he is the one who made me biologically connected to my native family, to the Secwepemc Nations. So at 28, after living for a decade on the East Coast, I made the probably pretty unusual and unsexy decision to move back in with my old man, a guy who still owed me at the time the money I had loaned him to come to my own high school graduation, just to give you a sense for the history. And after not living together for 22 years, because he left myself and my mother when I was about 6 years old, suddenly we were living across the hallway from each other, cooking each other breakfast. He was in the garage doing his artwork while I was sitting at my writer's desk with my writer's back, plunking away at the keyboard. And I'll just say as an aside, like, being the son of a visual artist, you constantly have envy if you are someone who does work at a computer, because while I'm sitting there with my awful writer's back, reading JSTOR articles, my dad is like out in the garage, like jamming out to Zeppelin, adzing away at a log and like, taking rips from the bong. Like it's a pretty cool artistic practice. Whereas like with me, like it's not a hangout session. Like if I'm doing my work, and you probably can identify with this as a writer, like nobody can really talk to me. I have to be really focused and doing my thing. It's like not a very hot artistic practice. So while I was doing that, I was reconnecting with my dad. At night, I'd turn on the recorder on my iPhone while we hung out and smoked weed, and he told stories and stuff. And during the day, I would be doing research and stuff for this book. And one of the ideas that I had very early on was that I would use some pieces of my own people's oral history. At first, I thought it would be to like ornament the text as like interesting little interludes or something like that. And suddenly I found myself reading the largest body of our oral literature, which are the coyote stories about our trickster ancestor. And I was, looking across the hallway at my trickster father, who had abandoned me, but who was this epic mythic figure. And then I was looking at these 100-year-plus old anthropological texts that nobody reads anymore, full of stories about this epic mythological trickster forefather who had abandoned all of his children, Coyote. And then I was looking across the hallway at my dad, and then I was looking back at the text and at my dad and back at the text, and all of a sudden it hit me like, oh my God, like the Coyote stories are in part a way for us to understand men like my father. Like it's a very capacious tradition, and it includes many different interpretations, and it has many meanings. But one of them is clearly to understand the patriarchs in our life who can be a bit complicated and yet who still make our world. And that idea really transformed the whole project, because suddenly I was asking myself what it would be to write narrative nonfiction in a way that took the nonfiction traditions of my own people, the Coyote stories, which have never been taken seriously by narrative nonfiction, seriously as a nonfiction art form, and to bring those back to life on the page. Because, by the way, this is a tradition that, at least among my own people, has almost completely died out. I have only heard one uncle ever tell a Coyote story, and he was like one of my grandfather's like many stray kids. My grandfather had like 19 children who I could name, and he didn't raise all of them. And this was one of the ones that we met like much later in life when he was like north of 50. And so, this really was a tradition that had nearly died out. And that was something that really mattered to me because, of course, with the documentary, I was directing a study essentially of the system that had very nearly wiped out my people's culture and way of life. And so it felt very important to me that the book and my other work was part of the project that I think all Indigenous people see ourselves as part of, which is to bring back the things that were nearly killed off by colonization.
You've touched on so many things I'm interested in and hope you'll talk about. The story of your father and the title of the book feel very connected. And for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading this yet, it's a braided narrative. It's a family memoir. It's people's history, and it's a collection, or collection always sounds random, interwoven with Coyote stories. But but I also want to interject something I've wanted to ask a Native person preoccupied with Coyote for a very long time. What about Wile E. Coyote?
Yeah, so just firstly, one of the most interesting sort of insights that you'll see, not just in the Coyote stories, but across lots of trickster narratives, is that we often believe that elements of our own culture were stolen, in a sense, from the supernatural, from, figures who were other than or greater than humans. So, for example, one of the main narratives in the book is a story about how Coyote steals salmon and leads him up the river for the first time, which is one of the largest Coyote stories that you'll see all throughout the Northwest. And in the story, Coyote, in the beginning of it for us, he's gotten into a feud with his son, who has tricked him and sent him washing down this river because he's abandoned his son and tried to steal his son's wife. And so he gets caught in a fish trap that's being operated by these two witches at the beginning of time, and they're catching all the fish for themselves, which, there's a clear moral lesson here, which is like, don't catch all the fish in the river because you screw everybody else who's upriver, which, like, by the way, like, we still haven't really learned that one, at least in this society. Very important indigenous teaching, don't catch all the fish. And so Coyote then sets about figuring out a way to steal the fish and lead them up the river because, he sees an opportunity for himself. And so he breaks their dam and he leads the fish up the river. And then he, as I said in my intro, uses them to try to marry into every single native village along the river. And I think what's interesting about that is, for my people and many people throughout the West Coast, all the way from here up to Alaska, the way that we got about half of our calories every year was from salmon. And so we understood that at the basis of our culture was this smash and grab by our trickster ancestor forefather who was feeding us for all time, but wasn't doing it for altruistic reasons because he turned around and then used those fish to his own advantage, which I think gets at a lot of the way that change actually really does happen in the world. So I think that Wile E. Coyote is probably another example of culture being stolen. And, we're in America, guys. Like, the whole thing is stolen. Like, I don't know. Maybe that insight from the Coyote stories is on point. And so, you brought up the title of the book and the woven nature of the narrative. So the way that in the book, what I'm trying to get at is the truth that these narratives still hold. And those truths exist on multiple levels. So, for example, and this one always blows my mind. The fish dam that we say Coyote broke, where we situate that in our oral history, is the same place that 11,000 years ago, geologists and sort of scientific experts will tell you there really was an ice dam that held up a series of glacial lakes across the interior of what is now British Columbia, Canada. And 11,000 years ago, that ice dam really did break and form the present course of the Fraser River, which allowed the salmon to go up that river. So in our oral history, which was remembered generation to generation, told and listened to and retold and listened to across thousands of years, there is an oral memory of an event that is thousands of years older than the Bible, that is thousands of years older than the pyramids, that goes all the way back to the end of the last ice age. And when I learned that, I was just sitting there going, like, how can this truth of this essential part of our environmental history, of the last chapter of climate change, by the way, be right there in the Coyote stories, and yet this entire tradition has never been taken seriously by the people who claimed the land on our behalf, And so I think that what I'm trying to do with the Coyote stories in conversation with the family history and the memoir and the reportage is to show that these truths from our oral history have presence in our lives, have presence in the story of Indigenous peoples more broadly today, and actually can help us get at an understanding of what it is not just to be Indigenous, but to live on this land, which has been our land for a whole heck of a lot longer than it was anybody else's. And so that's why I came to this sort of woven structure of the narrative, which is also, from a conceptual standpoint, a way of honoring what is, for my people, considered the highest art form. So among the St'át'imc people, my grandfather's side of the family, we're weavers. My great-grandmother Kihia was her Indian name. Her tax name was Annie Jim. She was a basket weaver. In fact, this design on Coyote's Sun spaceship, that's the name of this piece, it's Coyote's Sun spaceship, is one of her basket designs. And like, no offense to my father, the artist carver, but in our family, her artwork is actually considered our prized family heirloom, which I think is really interesting, right? Because weaving is also a feminine craft and tradition. And so in the woven nature of the book, which combines memoir, family history, reportage, oral history, and a little bit of what people might describe as criticism, I'm honoring the woven traditions of the Salish people more broadly. And also in the title of the book, I'm also working with another cultural form derived from our language.
The title, which comes from your grandmother's mug. Will you talk about that a bit more? But what I also wondered and was sort of asking, now I'm asking slightly more directly, does the title refer to the fact that your father almost didn't survive the night?
Yeah, I'll say two things. Firstly, so on the night of August 16, 1959, my father was born at St. Joseph's Mission, which is an Indian residential school near Williams Lake, British Columbia, Canada. And that night, the night watchman at the school, a guy named Antonius Cornelius Stoop, he was a Dutchman from the old country. They called him Tony. He wore his hair in a short cropped sort of everyman cut, and he wore these brow line eyeglasses. And it was his job at the night to walk the mission grounds and make sure that the Indian kids weren't up to any Indian mischief, like stealing food that they needed to eat or trying to run away back to the homes that they'd been taken care of, those kinds of things. And he heard, when he pulled up to the mission, this eerie cry that he described to the newspaper as sounding like the noise of a cat. And so he went investigating, flashlight in hand, and the sound led him to an annex at the back of the mission where there was a trash incinerator. And so he opened it up, and on top of the piles of rubbish and soot, there was an ice cream carton in which there was a newborn infant. And the babies called that infant Baby X, and he was actually my father. And that was a story that I, myself, nor my father, we did not know it until I set out to make sugarcane and to write We Survived the Night. Because the truth, at least in my family, in my community, of the Indian residential schools is that the way that we survived was by not talking about it. So it was not just the government and the church that perpetuated the silence of this colonial history. It was also often our own families and communities who had endured such horrendous things at these schools that the way that we tried to move on in our lives was by not addressing them, by not talking about them within our own families. And so I think in my work, part of what I'm asking is, what is it to break those kinds of colonial silences? What is it to reach into family trauma and try to put words and narrative and meaning to it? And one of the ways that I have tried to do that is by turning to my own people's language and culture. So as I mentioned, when my dad was found, the night watchman described his cries for life as sounding like the noise of a cat, which is a totally wild thing because, as you maybe can tell, my last name is NoiseCat, which is actually entirely coincidental. Or maybe it's not. Because the only reason my last name is NoiseCat, it has nothing to do originally with my father being discovered the way he was. My last name became NoiseCat because the missionaries wrote it down wrong. They were, coming up to our area, baptizing and marrying people and writing down their names, all weird. And they wrote down one of my family's ancestral names, NoiseCat, as NoiseCat. And so eventually over time it became NoiseCat. In fact, my father reclaimed that name when he got married to my mom, because either party in a marriage can reclaim a name. And my dad was like, I was raised after I was discovered by my grandmother, Alice NoiseCat, and I want to honor that and decolonize myself in some sort of way. So I'm going to reclaim this name, NoiseCat. And it was not until I set out to write We Survived the Night and to direct Sugarcane that we discovered that the story of my father's birth and survival had weird alignment with the name that he had reclaimed. So I think there's something in there about, Indian names. There's something in there about meaning. There's something in there about survival. And I think that there's also something in there about the truths that we get handed down from our ancestors, and also the truths that we run into on this strange journey of life. And the reason I've always been sort of drawn to those sorts of things is that, and this brings me to the title of the book, is that when I was in college, I spent time on the Canim Lake Indian Reserve, which is like over 1,000 miles in a country away from Oakland, California, where I grew up, learning Secwepemc Nation, the language of my people, which now only has 2 fluent speakers remaining on our res. It's just my Ke'a, my grandmother, and her sister. Those are the only 2 remaining. And when I would sit down to learn language when I was in college with my Ke'a, she would go to her cupboard and fetch a coffee mug. And on it would say Chochwinok, which I learned through these language lessons is the way that my people give the morning greeting. It's kind of like good morning, except it actually does not mean good morning. Instead, it means you survived the night. And after learning that, I often wondered what it was for my ancestors to greet one another and the day with the simple yet profound acknowledgement that they had lived to another morning. What did that mean in the winter of 1863, for example, when 2/3 of our nation died of smallpox? What did it mean in the mornings after the children were taken away to the Indian residential schools? And what kind of twisted humor decided to put "you survived the night" on the coffee mug of my grandmother, who was one of the only remaining fluent speakers of the language in which it was written, and like decided that that was what they should give her as a gift? Like, I just think that there's so much in there. Like, there's social commentary, there's poetry, there's dark humor. And I think that sensibility, which is the sensibility of a people who not only have survived, but also have so much vitality and love and depth within our culture, a wittiness that deserves its own kind of sitcom, is kind of what was always the inspiration for the book. I knew long before what the book would be about that it would be called We Survived the Night. And in the stories that I'm trying to tell, I think I'm trying to bring that tradition back to life on the page, including by using words from our own language, which, if you have a problem with that, there's a big glossary at the back where I show you how to pronounce them. And there's an audiobook that I read so you can listen to how they all are supposed to sound.
Oh my gosh. You know what? As you were speaking, I pictured stories themselves being caught in a dam and a fish trap, the stories that didn't get where they were supposed to go. And I thought about the fact that the last 50 years as social, political, racial, indigenous revolutions has been about like breaking the dam and letting the stories out, letting the fish swim upstream. You said early on, and you say in the book, that these residential schools were to unlearn how to be an Indian. And I wanted you to talk about the story, the stories that are forgotten, the stories that were too painful to tell, the process of unlearning, and maybe memory as a political act and an act of power. That's all.
Wow, that's a big question.
Go wherever you want with it.
I think that part of what I am trying to do in this book is, the story of North America is rarely, if ever, told from the perspectives of its first peoples. And so this book, firstly, it's a transnational book. It's neither a book about Indigenous peoples in the US nor Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's a book that is about Indigenous peoples in relationship to our land without regard for borders, because I'm trying to decenter the Americanness and the Canadianness at the center of the narrative. I'm trying to tell a story about Indigenous peoples in relation to each other, to ourselves, to our culture, and to our ways of telling stories, which I think still get at a lot of the truth within our own lives and within the world, more broadly. What I would say is that there's a lot of things that Native people have endured that we ourselves, do not talk about. And I think one of the pieces of this history that I myself, I guess, have lived through is that, firstly, there was a conspiracy against indigenous peoples all across North America. And I kind of sometimes felt like I was losing my mind trying to convey this to people when I was out there promoting the documentary Sugarcane, because I think that people are kind of mind blown when they learned that an entire race of people were denied the right to parent their own children for multiple generations, for in some places over 100 years. And what happened? I mean, many things happen when you deny people that right. But one of the things that happens is that eventually people unlearn how to do things like parent, So my father's story, in a sense, is the story of a child who was abandoned in the incinerator at the residential school by a mother who was never parented by her own mother and father because that was denied under Canadian law at the time. And then my father went on to become, a father to two kids who he himself didn't raise because he had never seen anybody be a dad. He had never seen anybody parent before. One of the most horrifying things that you'll hear survivors of residential and boarding schools say is that when they were children, they didn't know what it was to be loved because they didn't have parents. People were so confused by these experiences at the schools that sometimes they would show up at these schools, and you got to think about it, like all these Indian kids are being sent from these reservations to these schools where the missionaries, the priests and the nuns, they didn't know who all in the student body was related. So one of the things that also sometimes would happen would be like, I have an auntie who's considered a significant matriarch in our nation, and she'll say with a chuckle, like, yeah, when I went to school, I didn't know that Paul, my husband, was my cousin. And that's one of the things that happens, right? Like when you deprive a people of something that is fundamental to how society is supposed to function, you're supposed to know who you're related to. You're supposed to know who your ancestors are. Those sorts of things were filled with all kinds of knowledge and relationship and wisdom. It was where you could go fish when you needed food. It was where you could go hunt when you needed, deer. It was where you could go gather berries. It was, who would come gang up on your enemies when you needed someone to gang up on your enemies. It was where you needed to run when your enemies started to come for you. It was all of these things and more. And it was all woven together with love and food and culture and exchange. And all of that was almost completely broken by a history that was purposefully attacking that very thing, the family structure, the community structure, because Indians were believed to be backwards because our way of life was considered bad. And I guess what I'm trying to say with this book and with my work is that the very opposite is true, that the indigenous way of life is a good way of life and a beautiful way of life. And in fact, if you look out across the developed capitalist world at the crisis of connection, the crisis of meaning, a system wherein we've done this weird experiment wherein everybody tries to live within an individuated life or within the nuclear family, I don't know. We have a whole bunch of existential problems now that are in part stemming from the fact that humans did not live that way until like the post-war era, until the present. And maybe, crazy thought, the people who are still holding on to what it means to be related to one another, what it means to be related to the land, people who, like, I had a cousin 2 weeks ago help me fill out a housing application. The same week his mom, like, let me sleep on her couch. Like, people who live that way, the way that people have been living for the vast majority of human history, maybe there's something essential in our humanity about those kinds of things. And I think that part of what, you know, I think part of what Native people are trying to do is to show others that these things are essential, that they have value, and that by reclaiming them, we can also have a conversation about the awful things that happen to us from a place of pride and power, because we are not just, and this part I think is really important, because I think it's hard for it's I find that in like a sort of liberal crowd, it's possible for people to go, wow, we did awful things to the Indians, but for whatever reason, I think the part where we go, and the natives actually had a pretty damn good way of being, like, you know, maybe we should empower them more. That part I think can be a little bit more challenging for people to see and acknowledge, because I think it undermines one of the bedrock principles at the basis of our entire society, which was that it was progress to take the land away from its first peoples and to see them die off and their cultures go away. And, you know, maybe not.
Definitely not. But what was I going to say? As somebody about twice your age, I've watched how we settler colonialists understand where the hell we are change so much. Obviously not enough, obviously not everybody, but the kind of stuff the white guys telling me that they were the first person ever to set foot someplace, probably, just the and it wasn't the bad guys, it was the environment, you know, it was the environmental movement that really insisted on conceiving of this thing called wilderness, which the Wilderness Act of 1964 describes as a place where man is only a visitor, which essentially, in a lovely preservationist phrase, wipes out 10,000 years and more of what was going on this continent. But it feels like, and that's kind of what I was angling at, that recovering history, language, culture, and land is, you know, that a kind of reversal is going on. And towards that, you know, that's sort of my opinion if you have comments. But I also wanted to ask you, you know, you've learned your people's language. I don't know if you qualify as a fluent speaker. You said there's only two. But something that's always fascinated me about languages, particularly ones that are really different from the one I'm speaking now, is the world looks different. And I wonder how studying the language with your grandmother has given you other ways of seeing the world and how they informed the film and the book.
Well, I'll answer that piece first. So in the book, I write about the Salish languages, which is a big language family in the northwest part of the United States and Canada. They are a very studied language family by linguists, because if you sort of caught how the introduction struggled to pronounce some of our words, there's a complicated phonology, is the way that linguists would say that. And you know, that meant that linguists wanted to study us, which I guess created some benefits, which is that like our languages were a little bit more documented, and there's actually some understanding of our linguistic history, and actually some of the bedrock principles and modes of analysis in the field of linguistics were actually developed through the study of our people. So for example, this guy, Morris Swadesh, whose name I'm not sure I pronounced correctly, but it's okay, they pronounce ours wrong all the time. He developed this thing called a Swadesh list, which is where you take a bunch of languages across a language family, you create a list of about 100 words, and then based upon the number of cognates between the languages, you can figure out how closely related they are. And then if you do that across a number of languages, you can project back in time an estimation of how long ago those languages shared a common ancestor, which is how, for example, we know that Jean Quick to See Smith's people and my people are like distant cousins. Like 5,000 years ago, we were probably living in the same village, dealing with the same deadbeat dads, you know, chasing around the same coyote, etc. And so one of the most interesting things that I encountered in my readings of like these weird linguistic papers about my people was that the root word in what they would describe as Proto-Salish, so whatever that ancestral language is reconstructed by linguists, for people and land is actually one and the same thing, which is a fascinating intellectual insight because it suggests that our understanding of what it is to be human is inherently tied to having a relationship to the land, and vice versa, that land itself cannot be understood without its relationship to humanity, which I think is a very, very different way of looking at place and the environment than, sort of a colonizing way of like looking at it and saying that's mine because my God said so. I would say also that I guess throughout this book, I found myself drawn to stories of indigenous peoples that I felt I might learn something myself from. So I wasn't that interested in like the kind of 101, like, the natives had their land taken and like they're still here kind of a thing. Like to me, I wish could move on from that in this country. And I was in particular drawn to stories where indigenous peoples still have a great deal of agency and wherein, our actions, our movements, our political leaders are shaping affairs beyond indigenous life, are shaping things that are essential to understanding North America and what's happening across this land now. In the book, you'll read a story about how Deb Haaland became the first ever Native American cabinet secretary. You'll learn about the first ever Governor General of Canada who has Indigenous background. Her name's Mary Simon. She's Inuk, she's Inuit. And interestingly, she rose to her position through the Inuit movement rather than through the sort of Crown's political traditions or through Canadian politics, and has played an outsized role in shaping politics internationally in the Arctic, wherein Inuit people are actually very consequential actors. You'll hear about indigenous peoples who are intervening in various environmental questions and struggles of the day, like the Nuyalk Nation on the west coast of Canada, who are reviving their ancestral governance system over their territory as part of a broader strategy to protect the forest and therefore to fight climate change. And you'll also, see indigenous peoples who are playing politics in a very interesting kind of different way, like the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, a tribe that describes itself as being descended in part from the lost colony of Roanoke, the first English settlement in North America, that is the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River, and who has yet to gain federal recognition because it is impossible under the ways that the laws are written around who does and does not get to count as native in this country, for us to imagine something that has actually happened with great frequency in real history and events, which is that at times it wasn't the natives who were assimilating into the broader colonial society. It was the colonizers who were like, actually, maybe we're going to throw our lot in with these Indians over here and join them. And if you look at the history of the Lumbee tribe all the way back to the lost colony of Roanoke, but all the way through beyond that, the history of their people is not just of native people choosing to self-determine as native. It's black people, white people, all sorts of different neighbors of theirs were like, actually, if we're going to marry into any community here and be part of any community around here, we're going to choose to be part of these Lumbee down in Robeson County. And very interestingly, that tribe is now on the verge of potentially gaining federal recognition from Donald Trump because they've also been significant political actors in the history of North Carolina and the South, going all the way back to the Civil War. And, you might have your own ideological differences. I certainly do with the positions that they've taken, but you cannot deny that they are a significant way of looking into not just the native story, but the American story, and a way that indigenous peoples have had real influence in the course of events in ways that are never seen or narrated.
One of the things that was so striking to me when I was writing a field guide to getting lost and read a bunch of captivity narratives is how often captivity narratives are in a genre of American literature by people who were taken captive by Native people. lots of it from the 18th and 19th century. But what would perplex the white people is that the people who had often been taken quite young didn't want to go back, refused to go back, pined away and died in some cases when they were forced to go back. And it felt like a really, voting with your feet in the most serious way. I wanted to ask, and we should probably wind up and go to questions. Has your dad read the book? And it's such a remarkable story about his transformation too.
Yeah, my dad read the book. He lost his first copy in New Zealand. We were there screening the film, and he didn't tell me until like a couple months later. He was like, "Yeah, I lost the book." But he did. I got him another one, and he did read it. And for the first time after he told me that he understood some of the pain that he had put me through, and that he was sorry, and that was the first time he'd ever said something like that to me in my entire life. He came to my talk just like 3 days ago in Seattle, and has been a huge champion of the film. He came on the road with Sugarcane quite a bit. He's really proud of the book, and I think what I would say is that, like, in my own people's storytelling traditions, the most frequent place where I've seen people sit around and tell stories about each other is usually at funerals. And when you sit around and hear people tell stories about the departed at funerals, it's not just hero stories. It's stories about, the times that they shared where they had like a 2-week bender together, or, the time that uncle won the rodeo and then used his winnings to, have the most epic party afterwards. It's stories about, bad things happening sometimes that have like some humor mixed in. It's tragic stories about, something bad that happened between two people, and yet they still loved each other and still were there to shovel dirt and tears and stories atop, the grave. And ultimately, I think for me, telling a story, when I've seen it done in my own family and community context, is a gesture of saying, I know this person so well that I shared this part of our lives together, and that is evidence of my love for them. And so, I think that the way that I've approached some very difficult stories from my own life and my own family in this book is within that tradition. And I think that what I'm incredibly grateful for is that my own family intuitively understands and sees that. And over this last week, they've all been sending me pictures of them listening to the audiobook while they're driving their truck through Western Canada. Because, I don't think that many of them are going to read the hard copy version. But that's okay. I do the read, and, our culture was oral for the vast majority of its history anyways. So
I kind of love that audiobooks have become a way for people who don't like print to keep being literate and literary are completely different things. So I just have to ask you one thing, and then we'll take some questions, which is, when I met you, you were a climate organizer. And, well, 2 questions. What's next? And what about climate?
So climate really deeply shaped my thinking in this book. There's probably a little bit more environmental thinking around this, because I would say for the last decade, Indigenous peoples have had a little bit of an outsized voice on discussions about environmental and climate issues in this country. It's probably one of the only issues where we have. And, I think that part of my interest in those topics and in politics more broadly developed from the time that I was working in those things as an activist and as an organizer. And I think that part of what I was trying to, throughout the book, I'm interested in learning things, but I'm also in particular drawn to stories of how this all actually works and how people from my background, my subject position, are navigating what it is to be Native in a way that gets them a little bit closer to what we all want, which is to reclaim our power, reclaim our culture, reclaim our land. And I think that, there are surprising stories out there. And I guess part of what I found myself drawn to was stories that made me think and made me change my mind about what I assumed were the ways that we could do those things. You know, I think, for example, the Lumbee tribe story is a very interesting story. Um, Similarly, you know, how Deb Haaland became the first cabinet secretary, the story of how Mary Simon rose to become the representative of the crown in Canada, which is like literally the most imperial institution you could ever possibly imagine. And I think that those are all really instructive and interesting stories that I found myself interested in because I still am very curious about what actually does drive change in our society, particularly in a confusing time like this one. Um, what's next is I've started on a next book. It's a novel. Uh, my editor and publisher made an offer on it, but I got to make a living. So I'm going to keep writing and see if I can get more money. um, it's a hard time out here. We're in a cultural recession, everybody. It's a hard time to make art. And I've started on my next documentary. We just got our first grant for that. And yeah, you know, I just love what I do. I love telling stories. I love making art. And I think that the real coyote trick in my work is like convincing these cultural institutions, publishers, distributors, grant makers, what have you, to give me the money so that I can keep making the art. Like that to me feels like the trick at the core of it all.
Well, may that trick continue to work as well as it has for the Oscar-nominated film and this best-selling book. Congratulations on both.
So we're going to take a few questions before we end to have our book signing. Does anyone want to start with a question or comment? Oh, there we go.
I actually saw your movie on the big screen. But my question to you is, you're wearing the American flag around your head. Do you consider yourself American or Indigenous or Native American, and your family background is from Canada? Just curious.
So I saw an exhibit at the National Museum of the American Indian a few years ago of images of Native people in this country with the flag, you know, like Ira Hayes at Iwo Jima and all these other things. And I think that sort of artsy part of it is in the back of my mind. I also am hyper conscious of the particular moment that we're in. And, you know, listen, I'm going to rooms full of people who are probably left of center at a time when there's real political violence happening. And so if something were to ever happen, I just want to be in an American flag so that they're all really confused. um, and you know, they'd be like, "Oh my God, they shot him and he was wearing an American flag, but he was singing about how it's all Indian land." Like, I guess I just want to mess with them. And you know, if you look very closely, the stars are going that way. So.
In the documentary, there's a scene where you are swimming with your dad. How cold was that water?
It was very cold, and he was very hesitant to get in it. But that is actually in the documentary. That's Canim Lake, so that's the lake that our res is named after, even though we don't have any property on the side where there's roads. Funny how they do that to us all the time. Weird. And yeah, so throughout the documentary, this is never made explicit, but it's gestured at. It's a story of homecoming and a story of reconciliation and healing between the two of us. And one of the most ancient forms of ceremony that I think many different people, not just indigenous ones, share is like bathing, is like dipping in our water, in particular, you know, our ancestral homelands. And so while I was doing this work with my dad to bring him back to his mom and back to the mission, it felt really important for us to be doing ceremony together. And so even though he was like complaining about how cold the water was and everything, I was like, "You gotta get in the damn water, Dad. Just didn't bring you up here so you wouldn't get in the damn lake that our people come from." And he did it. He was a good sport about it.
I better stand up. Do you know about this book?
It's called Old Coyote and Big Sur.
Written by, well, it's written by his daughter, but it's about Jaime de Angulo. Jaime de Angulo lived in the 20s. He was an anthropologist, linguist, actually a medical doctor, also a cowboy and rancher, and a very eccentric individual. But he wrote another account. He would go and live with the Indians. He lived with the Miwok and Pit River Indians, among others, in Northern California, and translated. He learned their languages and translated. He got a grant from the UC Berkeley, and I think those translations are there. But in the meantime, he also was a writer, and he wrote his own books, kind of related to how the Indians wrote or how the Indians express themselves. And one of them is Indian Tales, which actually he read on KPFA. You may know about it.
We do. I know. I have a few of his books. He's quite amazing and did go around and drag a bit. And do you have a question? Or was it just, do you know Jaime
Well, I
Dan?
just
Hello.
wanted to know if he knew about Jaime.
No, so I mostly was looking at the ethnographers of my own people up in Canada. We had a guy named James Tate. I'll tell you about our white guy. Our white guy was this guy named James Tate. He was a Shetlander, which is the people who were colonized by the Brits and the Scottish and all that stuff. And he ended up all the way in Spence's Bridge, British Columbia, which is still to this day pretty rural place. I could tell you a whole story about a part of Spence's Bridge that my uncle lives in, but that's too long of a story. Well, they call it Billyville because everybody there is a Billy, and my uncle's married in there, and they're all on the side of the river right there. Anyways, so James Tate was a socialist, and he married into the Enlakatmuk of Spence's Bridge. He spoke the language. He was a really good guider. And in fact, he worked with Franz Boas, the sort of father of modern anthropology. He was kind of a better anthropologist than Boas, it seems. And in part, I say that because he got very involved with our struggle to get our land back, because in British Columbia, basically the entire province was taken, kind of like California, without any treaties or recompense for the First Nations. And so he became a secretary for a series of Indigenous organizations that were going to Ottawa and to London to, sue the Crown and the Prime Minister to do something about this. And he got so involved with that Boas started getting irritated with him because he was like not doing the field work that Boas was paying him to do, and was instead trying to get the land back for the natives. And then unfortunately he died before he got to be too old, of some sort of pelvic abscess type situation. But what I'm saying is we had a cool white guy too.
Thank you, Julian. You're an amazing storyteller, and I love your sense of humor and irony. And my question is, in the writing of this book, did you spend any time at the School for Native American Writers in Santa Fe? And
At IAIA?
Yeah, in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
No, my dad lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so I do write about Santa Fe, New Mexico. In fact, Rebecca offered a very important correction to the text based upon her knowledge of Santa Fe, New Mexico. But when my dad left our family, he moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, because it's kind of like the Mecca of Indian art. Like all the turquoise and silver in the world can be found in Santa Fe, usually in a glass case above a painting, before a painting of like Monument Valley with like a Navajo on horseback.
Yep.
And so yes, I've spent a good amount of time in Santa Fe, and I'm going to IAIA to give a talk in January. And my dad was an adjunct there like 20 years ago. It's a wonderful institution, and it almost lost some essential federal funding to keep its doors open.
I know Tommy Orange spent time there.
He did his
Got a lot
MFA
of
there, and
help,
he
so
still
thank
teaches.
you.
Yeah.
One more question.
Hi, I'm curious about Coyote, and I'm curious about how Coyote might have tricked you in the writing of the book. Maybe there's an example of how Coyote intervened in a story or a sentence or even a thought.
It's a good one. It's a really good question. I think what's interesting about Coyote is that he's not just tricking, he's often himself getting tricked. I think there's a real duality in the figure of the trickster. So he's both like incredibly clever and remarkably foolish at the same time. I would say that that Jean Quick to See Smith story is one of the most interesting Coyote tales amidst the whole thing. I would say that, yeah, that's a really interesting one. Yeah, I'd have to think about that a bit more. I mean, maybe the 10-minute performance is the best thing that I can pull out of my ass at the best thing.
Thank you, Frank. And I think we're going to wind up.
I think so. We're
Thank you all so much. Books are for sale. Support your independent bookseller.
Thank you.
And
Yes.
the line forms to the left.
And our author. Books are available at the counter, and we're going to do a quick change at the stage here so that